Hello, everyone, and welcome to Awareness Wednesday. I'm Taylor Bunn, Executive Director of Hope for All, and we've got some new faces here today. So Awareness Wednesday is an initiative that we do to introduce our friends and audience to different organizations, people, ideas, projects that are inspiring hope and making the world a better place. So I am thrilled today to have with us future Dr. Ashley Hill and future Dr. Will McDowell. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and they're going to just lead us through a conversation on restorative practices in education. So just a little bit about what restorative practices are, how they're beneficial, and what we can do as individuals to promote this movement and make our schools great places for kids to be. So I'm going to pitch it to y'all and mute myself and take it away. If y'all have questions from the audience, feel free to chime in at any time, or you can put them in the chat, whatever works for you. And just really excited to get started. So Ashley, Will, take it away.
All righty. So I'll get started. I'm Ashley Hill. I am currently working for Rhodes School for the Performing Arts, which is a fine arts charter in Houston, Texas. I serve 3 campuses, and I serve as the school culture coordinator. And what that means is I basically get to employ restorative practices under the positive behavior instructional support umbrella. And so I've been a practitioner, I want to say, for about 5 years, but I still consider myself a novice. I really am still learning every day. And I started restorative practices when I was a classroom teacher. I taught for a total of 12 years. I taught grade 2nd all the way to 12th grade. And I've trained since then. I've trained students and teachers, and I've trained peer mentors, and I've done train the trainer model. So I have a pretty big wheelhouse. I'm also involved with a nonprofit called Project Curate, and we're talking about including some restorative practices in there as well. So that's a little overview and gist of my work. But yeah, go ahead, Will.
Yeah, I'm Will McDowell. I started my educational career back in 1995, and I've spanned being a classroom teacher, an instructional coach, an assistant principal, and did some research here in Missouri and realized that I was part of the problem. And that when I became a principal, I followed the book they gave me, and they said, hey, this is supposed to, what's going to happen here? There were even times early in my career, I have to own that I raised my voice, because when William got yelled at as a child and said, whoop, I pulled it together, and I thought, oh, that's what I'm supposed to do. Gratefully, because of the great work that's going on, we're evolving as a profession, and we're seeing much better ways, and for things ways of things that can be handled, and we can end the pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
Where when I talk about being part of the problem, it was studying that in the state of Missouri between 2009 and 2012, a Black child was 4 times as likely to be suspended from school as a white child for similar offenses. And there I was, a white principal in an all-Black school. A lot of times folks will use the term diverse school. It wasn't that. School was Black. Let's just say what it was, and what my role was in continuing some of those practices. So spent a year with the wonderful team in Missouri led by Nancy Johnson at the University of Missouri, doing positive behavior intervention supports, and working with Julie Blaine and her team at the University of Central Missouri Regional Professional Development Center. And it was there of like, let's look at some other ways, and how do we dig even deeper into this PBIS work, which I'm so glad that Ashley's doing that umbrella, and then the restorative practices of how they have come on. I was first introduced to restorative justice in my study of South Africa and what they did with the Truth Commissions, and I'm so grateful to see how it's evolving and coming into our schools today.
Awesome.
Yeah. So Ashley, if I could just start, I'd love to hear kind of your own educational history, and I delve in a little into that.
Yeah. So I started off. The funny thing is, I'm from Connecticut originally, and I got my start through Teach for America, but they kicked me out. They kicked me out because I am terrible at drastic change, and their model didn't work on me. I was not good at being indoctrinated by them. And so I got kicked out, and they told me I would never make a great teacher. And 12 years later, but yeah, so I started in 2007, and I found a really great school called the Rhodes School. and started teaching second grade. Now, the funny thing is, the principal that hired me is now my superintendent. And she came and found me at the high school I was working at and was like, I need you to come back. So I'm here full circle, which is pretty cool. But, you know, to continue that story, I basically taught second grade for 3 years. I looped and taught third, fourth, and fifth for a year. And then I skipped middle school altogether and then went into the classroom. And I tell this story because it really does have an impact on my my time as a restorative practitioner, because I was so tethered to the classroom for so long that I really didn't understand necessarily the full impact of legislation and data and all of the different things, you know, cogs in the wheel that we're churning. And now that I'm outside of the classroom, I'm seeing a lot more of a global perspective. And so it gives me a lot more insight in terms of like how far reaching this work is. And like you said, you mentioned the pipeline and impacting that. So the work I get to do now, I get to push into classrooms and hopefully bring to light some of the things that classroom teachers don't necessarily get to see from that perspective. So yeah, I'm studying at Baylor. I'm in the, you know, doctoral program for learning and organizational change. So I feel like I'm, you know, where I need to be in terms of that work. And basically in the meantime, I'm on the ground, you know, training administrators, training teachers, and really just putting, you know, putting that into practice each day. So yeah, I hope that gives a little bit of a.
Yeah, it does. It does. I wonder, like, what has been your history with student discipline as far as first as a student and in your early career? I think that's I think you've touched on something.
Yeah. So in terms of my time in elementary school, I mean, I didn't learn about restorative until 2015. So I was already, I want to say, 7 to 8 years into my teaching career. Yeah. And I learned about it alongside my juniors that year. I was teaching AP English. It literally was something that I was questioning. I was a seminary student. Actually, I'm a master's in theology. So that also brought out some questions around, you know, retributive systems that are outdated. I was learning about liberation theology, which it actually leaks over into restorative work. And also I like to really center the indigenous community because that's where restorative started. And so we just started researching together. And when I taught elementary, I really thought back to like what I was, you know, what I would naturally do in terms of responding to behavior. Completely different ethic now, you know, compared to then. So I think restorative just really gives a lot more options and opportunities to respond to behavior, and it fits really well with PBIS. So I'm really glad that my superintendent brought me back in order to really start instilling this into our culture. I was thinking about Will, you know, being a white principal, and you know, what do you think about the role of, because I've been in spaces where when I went to, for example, my TEA, my Texas Education Agency training in Austin, Texas, with Dr. Gay Lang, who is phenomenal. She's training, you know, multiple white educators. I think I was one of the only 2 Black girls in the room. Sure. And, you know, what do you think of, I guess, as the role of white educators in this space when we're talking about PBIS and restorative, and like, what's it been like for you?
So where I come from it is in the 80s, when I was 12, my parents separated and my mother moved us into, and it was an all Black neighborhood. We were the only white family there. So I was able to see what my privilege gained me. As a teen, I was able to walk 4 or 5 blocks and get a job. And based off that job, I was hired to another job. And when I showed up with my friends from my neighborhood, there wasn't a job for them. However, kids from up the hill, which was predominantly white areas, then they could get a job. And unfortunately, Brandeis University did a study of my neighborhood it's the Capital District in New York. And of the 100 largest Black neighborhood, mine ranked dead last for healthy child development. So I was able to see both firsthand, and then it was backed with the research that shows, like, if you're born poor and Black, where I grew up, stayed there. And it was, I really understood the institutional racist system. I live here in Kansas City, and we have a famous street called Troost Avenue. And Troost Avenue is the historical, socioeconomic, and racial dividing line.
Wow.
where my school was, it was on the other side of Troost. And I think we as white Americans have to own that. A lot of white Americans will say, well, I didn't create that, so I'm welcoming to everyone. We have to realize where race comes into play, and we have to realize how we benefited from the systems.
I agree. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I have to own, where are the places where, I fell into traps of how I've exacerbated the system, but then what are the ways that I'm going to be open to reversing that system? And again, Taylor's heard me talk a lot about that. And at NIMSY, I'm proud our work, we're doing a lot of invitational leadership, and how are we intentionally inviting people in to be part of educational opportunities that they have not historically been part of.
Right.
Our AP courses, the demographics of the AP courses to mirror the demographics of that school, regardless of what it is. So I would say as a white male, we have to own our parts.
I agree. Thank you. Yeah.
So let me just jump in here for a second. I saw a momentary pause, so I had to jump on it. If you give us an example, what would restorative practices look like in a school? So we have Sally's joined us. She's a third grade teacher.
Hi, Sally.
Ashley, I did not realize people from TFA could sort of be
told, hello.
You're not a TFA'er. How could that have been handled in a restorative way, perhaps? Will, so we've got a couple of good examples here just to
let's get targeted on it. Sure.
Of what it is. Yeah. And then Will, I love just even the phraseology around invitational leadership. And so
yes.
when we do that, then hit us with what does it look like to be
You're asking a great question too.
Invitational.
So I'll take that one. Okay. So I guess a day in the life of Ashley Hill would.
Yeah, I think that would be good, Ashley. That's what I actually had. Take us through your day doing this.
Okay, so my day. Let's see. So I focus on a multi-tiered approach to restorative. So we're talking 3 tiers. There is community building, there is intervention, and then there's reentry. Those are the 3 main tiers that I deal with. And that is based on the TEA definition of restorative. That's based on the work of Dr. Armour and Dr. Gay Lang. All the research behind it, I'll post it in the chat. But I focus on that multi-tiered approach. So my first tier is where I'm building culture and community. I focus primarily on teachers, administrators, teachers, and students. Those are my 3 main groups that I basically bounce, between. And so at an administrative meeting, for example, I start off, and by the way, our model of PBIS is called CREW. That's our overall model. So within that framework of CREW, and it stands for Community, Responsibility, Relationships, Ethics, and Works. And within that framework, I focus on how we're building community, et cetera, and how we are becoming CREW in a restorative space. And usually traditional restorative practices, again, originating from indigenous communities where they did peacemaking circles, or family and clans will come together and solve problems together, basically between one another. It really starts with self, relationship between myself and others, and then our relationship to the community and nature as well. There's also an element of that too. So with my admin, my teachers, and my students at a tier 1 level, I'm focusing on building relationships in a circle. And literally we sit in a circle and we have a talking piece and we go around the circle and we share, and I ask questions that probe and engage, and that gets everyone talking. And it's amazing what happens, because folks sit in the space and they're kind of like, what is this? Is this like I've had people ask me, is this a seance? Are we going to pull out a Ouija board? It's very awkward at first because there is no table in the center, and it's very much a place of vulnerability. And so that circle space happens at all 3 levels, all 3 tiers. The tier 2 level is really where a lot of the heavy lifting comes in. When I'm at a tier 2 level, I might be pushing into the in-school suspension room with a few kids. Like yesterday, I had 2 students fight at one of my campuses. We have a tier 3 scheduled, but a tier 2 would be, okay, let's get these kids, let's separate them first, figure out what happened, do some pre-conferencing, and then bring them together in a circle space whereby they can hear one another, we can help solve the issue, and then we can decide on next steps. Do we need to continue with the consequence? Is there a way that we can make amends without that approach? How are we going to respond? It gives everybody an opportunity to hear one another and then to respond accordingly. At a tier 3 level, when it's reentry, it's all about coming back into the space. And I've seen this at different levels of, I want to say, the hierarchy within the school. So at the teacher level, I had a teacher who had a health issue, was gone for a while. She's a kindergarten teacher. And we proposed a tier 3 for her to come back and be ready to go, meet with her kiddos. Students who have been suspended or have even been in school suspension, when they go back into the classroom, they might need a reentry circle before they go back into the school or back into the classroom. So the circle, there's lots of different ways you can run a circle. There's so many different, ways of facilitating that. And so, like I said, I'd post some resources for you guys. There's lots of different information out there, but the Texas definition is based on community building and making sure that, let's see, what does Marilyn Armour say? She says, discipline as a relational approach to building school climate and culture. So that's the Texas version, the Texas definition of it. And so, yeah, that's pretty much what it looks like for me. And I do that, I want to say, on a weekly basis. I have one scheduled for next week, and Sierra can attest to that, happening in our different in-school suspension and behavior intervention spaces. And so, Gary, you're asking a question. Let me open this chat real quick and be able to address what you're saying about, yeah, there are different practices. Well, actually, it depends. There's different in terms of different practices for youth and adults. It's about the levels of questioning, right? So anytime I'm facilitating a circle, there's always especially if it's, well, really at any tier, community building, I need to know how many participants, who's participating. And then I, as the facilitator, it's my duty to develop questions that are appropriate. There's green, yellow, red questions, depending on level, the depth of the question and how risky it is. I always start with very low risk questions. The first being, who are you? How are you feeling today? And what's one thing you want to, one question you have or something you want to share with us today? Very organic. And I've done circles, I want to say, for a while with high school students. And one of the things that we would do, we had a student-led club that they put together. I was their sponsor, and they would meet every day on a Wednesday afternoon. They would put their circle together. They would have their centerpiece. They would set it up. Someone brought the talking piece, and we would just go around and talk about our day. And it was like almost like a counseling session, but just a very good, debrief and great way to decompress, if that makes sense. So there's lots of different ways to go about it. But yes, there are different practices for youth versus adult. It depends on the facilitator.
And it is happening in neighborhood and local court levels where they're looking at restorative practice.
Right. And so there's restorative justice. And I think one of the things that I've been working on lately is concretizing the difference between restorative justice and restorative discipline. Restorative justice happens as a response in the criminal justice system. Restorative practices and discipline are preemptive, and they happen in the education system. The two definitely overlap and align, but there are two different things happening in two different spaces. And even at the counseling level, there's a different way to go about it in terms of it being a little bit more clinical. But for me, I'm not a licensed counselor, so I do a lot more of mediating and giving folks the opportunity to hold space, share space, and give voice to the issues.
Ashley, the 4 questions that, and then again, this is in Better Than Carrots or Sticks, but the 4 questions I had was what happened, who was affected and impacted, things right, and how can others support you? So
exactly.
About that, how do I make it right again? And is that what you're doing when you violated some norm that has been established within the culture that you're
so
that, and now you're trying to restore?
Yes. Exactly, Will. The most straightforward way to describe restorative is it's the opposite of retributive. And when we ask questions, I'm a very Socratic educator, so I'm all about questions. So I love that you're going in on inquiry, because the three questions that come up in a retributive system: what law was broken, who broke it, what's the punishment that's warranted, right? In a restorative situation, it's all about who was harmed, what are the needs and responsibilities of all affected. So it's about people, which is what I love. And then how do the parties come together to address and repair? Yeah.
Can you go through the story of when this, I think an anecdotal of when this sparked off? You shared a story when we talked last week of how it really, you were pushed into this work and
Yeah.
with
I
a
love
group of
telling
students
this story.
collaborating.
This is
Yeah.
my favorite story. 2015. So I actually wrote a blog recently about this. And so if you're interested in, that, you can go read it. I definitely share on this. But in 2015, I was in the classroom with my AP English students. And at that point, I was teaching at a very large high school in Humble, Texas. We had a predominantly Black and brown student population. I will say 40% African American, 40% Hispanic, 20% white. And that's very, like basic generalization. But in the classroom, I have the AP scholars who are really super fired up about their learning. They care about their grades. They're the geeky kids. They're not really trying to get into too much trouble because they're really trying to focus on college and all of their future goals. So I'm teaching them in a class that is primarily focused on rhetoric and composition. So we're talking argumentation, we're talking analysis, we're talking writing a clear and concise, cogent argument. And so I started to ask questions about restorative because I was going through, seminary, and I was a teaching assistant at the time. And we were talking about liberation theology. And I was like, what do y'all think about this particular way of handling things? And so I start being Socratic and asking the questions, and we start generating ideas together. And we came up with the idea of what if it came from students, because we know that all of these things in our high school, there were actually lots of fights breaking out at the time. The media was, getting hold of these things via social media because students had access to their phones. And one of the big catalysts for this shift in our school, and I say 2015 as the year that I remember this happening, was because our district changed the cell phone policy. That was the year that, because the district mandated that, okay, now students can bring their own devices to school. Well, what ended up happening is giving students that level of autonomy and then putting the onus on teachers to monitor that. Kids are, breaking out in fights, but then the phones come out and it's on World Star and YouTube, Snapchat, Twitter, you name it. And, with our school being predominantly Black and brown, in the neighborhood, in a suburban area where everything is tied to tax dollars, any kind of negative media attention is going to really, take our outside view. It's going to take all of that down. So, folks are seeing our school in a very negative light. So at that time, I'm asking questions around that, and I'm asking questions around this thing we call restorative, which I had just heard of at the time. And so my students start to research and write. We came up with an idea to develop a symposium around the questions that we were asking, because we not only wanted to provide argumentation, but we wanted to ask our community and invite them into a conversation about it to see who would be willing to join us and start hopefully making the change. So the following year, my students were researching and writing this topic. I had, by the time we got to April, students had a full portfolio of essays. They came up with TED-style speeches on the topic. And we made a big deal out of it. We held it in our performing arts center. Students would get up on stage and give their speeches and make proposals for restorative change at the school. The principals saw it, and the principals felt very convicted by what the students were saying. And one of the main students who actually won a prize for her speech, she said that teachers and principals would require training. And that put the onus on us to decide whether we were going to take her up on that or not in order to move forward with the change that we wanted to see. So the following year, and this is now 2 years after I've even, concocted this idea with my students, we have principals receiving training from UT Austin and TEA. When my principals came back, they sent me and a group of other teachers. We built a team, and we hit the ground running with restorative at that school, and it completely changed that campus. And to this day, the district is now in full support of restorative practices because of one student's voice. And it started in a tiny classroom on the corner of the building. So that's pretty much how I got started. I was sent to training, I want to say, by a student who proposed the idea in the very beginning.
The term restorative to me,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times speaks to, hey, something bad has happened. Now we've got to restore. We've got to get it back into faith.
Right.
I think a lot of times, especially when there's teachers who are working with cultures different than theirs, or frankly, a race different than theirs, that some cultural missteps in where expectations are. Can you talk a little bit with PBIS? We talk about having the antecedent behavior consequence. Comes once after that consequence comes into play. Talk more about the antecedent and how you are building community. I know we started to talk about.
Yeah, that's an interesting.
That.
I really like that question. In terms of like an antecedent for me, I'll say this. I think because of my own teaching ethic and my own sense of vocation at that time, that's kind of what propelled me into asking the right questions at the right time, being responsive. And I call it emergent strategy. Honestly, it's actually based on the work of Adrienne Marie Brown. She's fantastic. Her book on emergent strategy actually gave me the language for what I had already kind of gone through. But what emerged, like that situation with the cell phones and the population, I started to see the different connections, and I responded in my classroom based on what I was already teaching. And when educators can see that and have that perspective, it lends itself to a fruitful conversation and also teachable moments that generate real life, I guess, learning, like authentic learning opportunities, because it turned into something where my students could write an argument because they actually argued for real change at their school. And so we can get into talks about project-based learning and all of that, but that is basically, I guess, for me, the antecedent is the teacher's willingness to question their own beliefs and their own understanding. And that's pretty much where I started. I think I didn't even know, I think at the time, it's so funny, I didn't even know what project-based learning was when I started. I just started asking questions. I knew what good questioning looked like because I had gone through that process in the seminary classroom and taught alongside my professors. So I knew, okay, this is what good inquiry looks like. I'm responding to what's really going on. What do y'all think about it? And I'm bringing you into the conversation along with me. And I think that made my students, it lifted them up in terms of their level of, I don't know, like, I guess gave them some more confidence in terms of their ability to, work with me on it. So.
Yeah. So actually you've gotten this, you've been in two different schools, if I'm understanding.
Yep, those two.
It sounds like in the first school, it was more the people lead, the leaders will follow. So
Right.
Bottom up. It sounds like in your other school, you were stolen where you are now. You were stolen to bring this and more top down. Actually, we need this here in our school. Let's put this in. Can you talk about the, I guess the from the bottom up and top down and
it's funny. So I started at the high school level. It was very much bottom up because I didn't necessarily go to my administrators and say, hey, I want to start this program. This is going to be great. We're going to do this initiative. We're going to impose it on teachers and students, and it's going to work. Instead, I started in the classroom. And so where I am now, because my former principal, now superintendent, came back and was like, I see all this great stuff you're doing. She saw that like my growth as an educator, it started, of course, year one when I was working in the elementary classroom, and in the spaces that I had worked in before, she noticed that there were connections between where I had come from and what I was doing at that time. Sure. And she brought me back in to start that bottom up process here. You know what I mean? So like, even though this was more top down, she's like, I want teachers to be empowered to do that. Like, I want to duplicate that. So what I'm working on now with the 6th through 8th graders is like a middle school symposium, and we're actually asking questions about crew. So we're getting them to generate ideas now. And what they're going to do is hopefully propose some things that even at their level of cognition, we can learn from and glean from, because one of the big things too is I always told my students, like, we're all learners. Like, I'm learning from you and you're learning from me. So yeah, that was
And talk to me about the teaching staff that you're currently working with. Is it a veteran staff that's having to shift in new ways? Or is it a younger staff, a newer staff that's saying, hey, I'm coming in this profession do with all these behaviors?
So it's a little bit of both. We do have some veteran teachers and we also have some newer folks. And so I kind of, depending on who my audience is, I try to make it, you know, as applicable and relevant for everyone as I can. But I'm thinking, you know, like I remember us talking about the demographic and how much teacher turnover we have. And depending on that and how long teachers stay, it really just depends. I guess it affects the longevity of the program, right? So I'm looking at all of that when I'm building content for them, but it's a mixture of both, honestly. But what do you think about, I mean, what have been like your training experiences and how have you sort of varied your training to your audience? Because I struggle with that.
Well, I think for me in training, I always said, I believe that you can teach children better than Jerry Springer can home. So if we're going to use a suspension and just let's get kids out, what are they going to be doing at home? Parents are still going to
TV.
What are we going to do? So I believe in you more. So we're going to figure out ways that we're going to keep them in school. And what do we need to do to create environments where students can be retaught. Parents can't replicate their child in a group of 25 to 35 other children. So there are going to be some things that we as school teachers, school leaders, that we've got to teach students in those spaces. Otherwise we can't, students aren't going to be able to get to that. So and I think once they buy in that and we build from that belief that you in these things, because the word discipline, what does it really mean?
Right.
You look it up, it's to teach disciples, you know.
Exactly. And then discipline, I actually unpacked this with a colleague of mine years ago. We talked about discipline in terms of discipline. We think of discipline as something like that we do to someone else or, you know, restorative is about with and for, you know, not necessarily doing it for you, but alongside you, you know, and sort of a symbiotic kind of deal.
And I think that's what educators also have to do to understand the communities they're serving. They have to not just go into those neighborhoods, but they have to be of those neighborhoods. And what are some ways they can do that? And I think it's a huge, huge difference. So, and again, it is also that mindset of coming in solidarity and horizontally,
I agree.
Vertically and top down. Because again, that's not to fall back on a South African Ubuntu. I am, and I think that's a huge piece.
Oh, another element. I taught social action as well at the high school level, and that was a big component. And you said solidarity, and that was one of their biggest lessons the first semester, and is in solidarity before. And I taught the class completely restoratively. Like every Friday was a circle day, and all of the different principles were restoratively charged. So that Ubuntu is definitely one of our class themes. And
wonderful. So if I'm a teacher, I'm the first, second year teacher, this is starting to interest me. Do I wait and try to convince the administration, or do I just start practicing?
I recommend no. Anytime we wait to get those guys on board, no. The students, the proof is in the pudding. So when I did the work with my scholars and they proposed and they wrote and they researched and the entire school saw what we were doing, I mean, they championed us. I was writing grants for this program. I mean, over $27,000 from the poured into the school because they, you know, saw what the kids were doing, and that was on behalf of them. So I think once the students are empowered and the educator is sort of the facilitator in that space, I think that is the best way to go. So I would encourage an educator to just start asking questions. What do you think about this? I'm inviting you into this, and let's, you know, and then grow from there. Like I grew my Socratic practice based on this. I grew in my project-based learning based on this. I grew in digital learning based on this. Like it really just helped me, because if we think of Bloom's taxonomy in terms of like how we learn, starting with the knowledge level, like I had no knowledge of this. It, you know, really, I guess came as a need. Like I need to know what to do next. I need to know what Socratic is in order for me to move into the next level of getting my kids to do X, Y, Z. So I would just encourage the teacher to ask the right questions, start asking questions.
So Ashley, let me ask you this. What's your why? Like, why is this such an important push for you that we use restorative instead of the old practices that, the book had? Hey, you know what the rules are, they are, and
People.
break it, the book says you get this.
Yeah, I want to say humans. Humans are my why. I think I value the human story. I value the stories of others, and I think it's so important to honor stories. And like with the indigenous community, I mean, that restorative is what brought me to an understanding of culturally relevant, teaching, and how to understand different communities and different cultures. So I just value. I have an ethic, a very intrinsic ethic of welcome that is really rooted in my Christian theology. And I just believe in that. And I think that is what has made me a better listener. It's also made me a better restorative practitioner. So, yeah, I think I can just about relate to just about anyone based on that ethic.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So you're talking a lot about like the practices of the indigenous cultures, or a lot of collectivism that we
Right.
but yet we're in a very individualistic society in the United States.
It's counter, very much.
Yeah. How do you reckon the two?
By being awkward all the time. No, I again, that ethic of welcome and trying to help others understand that they are safe in my, like whenever I invite others into my circle space, and really honestly honoring the process with fidelity. And when I'm doing that, I think that helps introduce others into this way of being that's countercultural to what we're accustomed to. And as it honestly feels, because I'm naturally an introvert, when I'm facilitating a circle, it is so awkward. The feeling of that is so like counter to what I want to be doing, but I lean into that. So I think that helps me to bridge the gap.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Taylor, I know we wanted to leave some time for the group to
yeah, we're going.
Is
we're going.
Yeah.
I want to be respectful of that need.
We do. We wanted to make sure everyone here in the audience gets their questions answered. Ashley put a bunch of stuff in the chat here for resources.
Yes, please copy paste that, y'all. That's some good stuff.
Yeah, and we'll share it out we'll put it on the blog and on social media and all that good stuff too. But what questions are there from the audience?
I have a question. Going back to thinking about restorative practices and kind of how we said that there's a difference between the youth and the adult, I just wanted to know, since I come from a non-educational background, how would you apply, restorative practices to non-educational settings?
I mean, if you have you can do it, like I said, at three levels. I mean, you can use it to build relationships on your team. You can use it to solve disputes on your team. You can use it to welcome someone new into your team. And that would be a tier 3 as well. So it depends on how you want to go about it. But again, there are many ways to facilitate restorative. There's also, like if you're coaching, for example, there's also a way of, embedding restorative language into the way that you mentor and coach. I call that a restorative chat. And actually, in the content that I push out to my teachers, this month is actually the restorative chat month. So they're learning about how to use the language of restorative, even when they can't formalize in a circle setting. Because a circle isn't always practical. Sometimes you need to, have a talk out in the hallway. But in terms of like outside of the educational setting, this is done in families. This is done on teams. This is not just an educational practice. It's way broader than that. So there's so many ways that it can be adapted. And again, these resources, I would say probably the best one would be the International Institution of Restorative Practices, iirp.edu, and restorativejustice.org is an overall sort of a general organization.
Thank
EDU
you.
offers lots of graduate courses as well. Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
I'm just so amazed how it's taken off.
Right. Yeah.
Is in 2011 when I started to look around and try to research this because I was an assistant principal and I felt like all I was doing was suspending kids.
Yep.
Looking for other ways, and Gettysburg University in Pennsylvania was the only place I could find that had this, and now it's everywhere. Or if you look at Butter Carrots or Sticks came out, that was like the preeminent book. So I went to check what else has been written since then, and like that doesn't even make the list
Right.
on Google or Amazon right now. So
when
many other things out there.
Yeah, when I started looking in 2015, Ohio had a thing, California had a thing, and TEA had just approved the grant. I want to say February. 2015, they had just approved a grant to train Texas administrators and teachers for free. And that's how my principal got trained. That's how I got my first training. And then since then, they have just moved everything to TEA in Austin, where poor Dr. Dr. Gay Lang is working on her own. The downside of this work is that it's so underutilized and underfunded. And so my big goal for 2020, moving into like Dr. Hill season, is figuring out the legislation and the data behind this being the way to go, because I really want us to put it at the forefront. Right now, it's still very much on the back burner in Texas, unfortunately, but it is gaining prominence.
So, Will, you made the point that as a principal, like you're suspending kids, like that's your recourse for things that go beyond run-of-the-mill discipline problems. I used to always see the same kids in detention. We've got the young man in Mont Bellevue, Ashley, near where you are, who's been out of school since before Christmas because his hair's too long.
We call them frequent flyers in my world.
Yeah. And so much of discipline and education has been punitive, which, and to your point, like this is trying to get away from that. But I think it can feel overwhelming if you're in that situation and this work appeals to you, but it doesn't line up with what's in the school's handbook, or, you know,
right. We battled that.
Somebody, if you're a rule follower, what is one thing that you would recommend to people to do today, starting now, we leave this call? What is one thing we can all do to support this type of work, even if it feels like there's not room for it in our current schedule?
Can I take that first, Ashley, and you pick it up?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I would say to teach. I mean, again, we expect when I love this from, again, this is a PBIS thing. When a child doesn't know how to do math, what do? We teach. When a child doesn't know how to swim, we do what? We teach. Child doesn't know how to ride a bike, we do what? We teach. When a child doesn't know how to behave, what do? And we punish. And that behavior might be perfectly acceptable and has worked for 13 years of that child's life outside of school, and still doesn't understand why is it not working here, because they've never been taught that, hey, within this frame, this is what we're going to need. And that's what we need to spend the time doing, and not just putting an expectation and say, oh, well, they know. Well, the reality is maybe they don't, and maybe they don't understand the why. Adults are not motivated to do things when they don't know the why. Why am I doing this? Well, let's talk to folks of why we're going to do certain things. Then what are the teachers doing to say, I'm going to be responsive to the needs of my students and not just expect to set a bar here and expect children to just know how to get here. So, Ashley, I'll let you add to that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest problems I ran into when I was starting this initiative at my former district was the principals had bought in because of student voices, but then the principals would then need to not only receive training, but also engage in ongoing education and I want to say ongoing development on the importance of the paradigm shift. Because while the principals may receive training, their mindset around discipline could still remain in a punitive mindset. Like immediately, there's just certain things that, where they are getting principals to understand their own discretion around certain things. Like, where can I use this practice and where do I need to be more punitive, and trying to understand that. But restorative, the thing about restorative is that it must be adopted in order to work well. It must be adopted wholesale. It can't be piecemealed. And a lot of principals and districts want to break it into little pieces, and we only use it here, but here, this is where we do this. And it's not a good thing. And that's why I really like how restorative is supported under PBIS, because PBIS is so widely accepted. So it's really easy for me to fit the language of restorative in with PBIS, and that makes it a lot more palatable for administrators who understand that language. I got a question down here. What's this? Oh, hi, Jesse. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. I think the other reality too, though, that we have to acknowledge is principals are drinking from a fire hose.
Yep.
And there's so many things that they're expected to be. And,
Yep.
And the average principal in a high needs school district is staying less than 2 years. Recently published in Education Week. So, and then when if we follow Blankstein's research, it takes 3 to 5 years for a cultural shift to happen. So we've got to add that support for administrators as well, figuring those things out. I know that I needed that grace in the time when I was in the role. And it's great that we have leaders working from the bottom up, Ashley, like you, who are staying in schools and moving that work forward.
Thank you.
Well, guys, we are unfortunately out of time almost. So we're gonna, I know it flies by. So thank you both so much for being here.
A pleasure. Thank you. Great
Conversation.
talking to you, Will. Thank you.
Yeah, as always, Ashley.
Tip of the iceberg with this work, but hopefully the movement will catch on and we'll start learning from it, learning from each other. I love, Ashley, that it was your students who got this started for you.
Too. I actually, real quick, I contacted them and shared that they were the centerpiece of my work. And I'm like,
oh, that's great.
I wrote about you. And then I actually met up with one for dinner the other night. On Sunday night, we had sushi. She's a college student at the University of St. Thomas. And she and I talked about the work we did together. I always told my students, I said, one day we're going to be colleagues. So I'm getting you ready to be I don't want to work with somebody who doesn't have any sense. And I always told them, so we can work together now because I know your ethic. I know where you come from. So yeah.
I love that. I love that. Well, thank you both.
Taylor, I'm sorry, before we jump off, what's coming up with Hope for All?
Right.
And what should I be looking forward to? Because I'm so grateful to be invited into this.
Yeah.
And now I want to keep being part of the movement.
Absolutely.
I'm so glad you asked us for the session closer. Awareness Wednesday is something we do every 2 weeks. And it's any great idea, any person, any organization. We've now had one on sustainable cooking and the economic and environmental impact of shopping at local farmers markets. We've had steps with horses for equine counseling and therapeutic riding. We've gone to playground adventures, inclusive playgrounds. So we have many interests. So with Hope for All, you can always find us working on equity, education, the environment, and equine related charities. So that's those are our 4 E's. We do the 4 C's for the 4 E's. So this will keep going. We have coming up soon, Wendy Light from evolve.ag is going to do an Awareness Wednesday series with us to help us think more about where the food we eat comes from. And
love it.
I know, yikes. I learned, she taught me some things about almond milk, so now I'm on oat milk. So get excited about that. So lots of this coming up. We have a collaboration moving forward with Playground Adventures. So we're going to help them build out a business plan, a sustainability plan for Ma's Cafe, which will be a concessions area and little cafe restaurant at the playground that will be staffed by people with disabilities. So that's really exciting, something that's coming forward.
Takes too much water. Almond milk is.
It takes too much water, and there's bees. She's going to share this. So like bee murder at a large scale to keep almonds growing. So it was really kind of upsetting, except that I'm terrified of bees, so I have mixed feelings. But lots of stuff coming from us, but the best way to keep in touch is we're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I almost said Pinterest, that's not right. YouTube, LinkedIn, and our website is www.hope4all.us. And I love doing this. I love doing Awareness Wednesday. So if y'all know other people we should be featuring, please tell me. Ashley, I'm gonna hit you up about Project Curate.
Yes, yes. Well,
Sierra will have to talk about the Underground Bowling Association. So there are so many opportunities, and well, you're exactly right. Hope is everywhere. So thank you for sharing one of your hopeful influences today. And we look forward to hearing more from all of you in the future. Thanks, guys.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.